The thunderous crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Yreka, California, sending Sarah Fletcher diving behind a water trough as a spray of wooden splinters exploded from the post above her head. She clutched her ragged travel bag against her chest, heart hammering wildly against her ribs as the mid-afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the mining town in the summer of 1872. This wasn't the welcome she had expected when the stagecoach dropped her off just an hour earlier. "Get back here, you thieving witch!" bellowed a red-faced man with a half-empty bottle clutched in his hand, stumbling as he attempted to reload his pistol. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. The accusation was false. She hadn't taken a thing from the saloon where she'd inquired about work, but the drunken miner wouldn't listen to reason. 23 years of life had taught her that men rarely did, especially when they'd been drinking. "Drop that gun, Porter, before you shoot some innocent bystander," came a commanding voice from behind the miner. Sarah peered cautiously around the edge of the trough. A tall man stood in the middle of the street, his stance wide and confident. The tin star pinned to his vest caught the sunlight. "Sheriff, this ain't your concern," the drunk slurred, though his gun hand wavered slightly. "Anyone firing shots in my town is my concern," the sheriff replied calmly. "Now, what seems to be the problem?" "This woman," the miner spat the word like it tasted foul. "She was sneaking around, looking to steal from honest folk." The sheriff's eyes flicked toward Sarah, who slowly rose from her hiding place, clutching her bag with trembling hands. "I was only asking about work, sir," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've just arrived on the afternoon stage and need employment." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, taking in her worn but clean dress, the small bag that clearly contained all her worldly possessions, and the weariness in her eyes. "Porter, go sleep it off," he finally said. "Miss, come with me. We'll sort this out at my office." Sarah hesitated, glancing around at the curious onlookers who had gathered to watch the commotion. The last thing she needed was more attention, but the sheriff's calm demeanor suggested safety, at least for the moment. She followed him down the dusty street, past weathered storefronts and wooden buildings that made up the mining town of Yreka. The gold rush that had once made this area boom had subsided, but the town remained, sustained by the mines that still produced and the supply lines to other settlements. The sheriff's office was a small building with barred windows and a desk piled with papers. He gestured for her to take a seat while he settled behind the desk. "I'm Sheriff Daniel Morgan," he said, removing his hat. "And you are?" "Sarah Fletcher, sir." "Well, Miss Fletcher, Yreka isn't usually this welcoming to newcomers." His mouth curved into a slight smile. "What brings you to our town?" Sarah's hands twisted nervously in her lap. I'm seeking a fresh start, Sheriff. I have some experience as a seamstress and was hoping to find work here." Sheriff Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Wilson at the general store might be able to help. She's been talking about needing someone with needle skills." He paused, scrutinizing her. "But I get the feeling you're running from something, or someone." Sarah's gaze dropped to her worn boots. "Isn't everyone running from something in these parts?" The sheriff's laugh was dry. "Fair point, Miss Fletcher, but trouble has a way of following people, especially out here. I prefer knowing what might come knocking at my door." "No trouble will follow me," she assured him, though she couldn't quite meet his eyes. "I promise you that." Before the sheriff could press further, the door swung open and a man stepped inside. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a sun-bronzed face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. Dust covered his clothes, suggesting he'd ridden some distance. "Tucker," the sheriff greeted him. "Didn't expect to see you in town this week." Supplies, the newcomer replied, his deep voice matching his imposing frame. His gaze shifted to Sarah, and she felt a curious jolt as their eyes met. He quickly tipped his hat. "Madam, this is Miss Sarah Fletcher," the sheriff explained. "Just arrived on the stage. Miss Fletcher, this is Tucker Northrop. Owns a cattle ranch about 10 miles outside town." Tucker Northrop nodded politely, but Sarah noticed his eyes, a striking shade of blue lingering on her face with curiosity. "Miss Fletcher had a bit of an unfortunate welcome," Sheriff Morgan continued. "Porter Miller took exception to her asking about work at the Golden Nugget." Tucker's expression darkened. "Porter's becoming more trouble than he's worth these days." "Indeed." The sheriff turned back to Sarah. "As I was saying, Mrs. Wilson at the general store might help with work. You can mention I sent you." "Thank you, Sheriff," Sarah said, rising to her feet. "I appreciate your assistance." "One more thing," Sheriff Morgan added as she reached for the door. "Where will you be staying?" Sarah paused, her hand on the doorknob. The truth was, she hadn't thought that far ahead. Her meager savings would barely cover a night at the hotel. I'm not certain yet," she admitted. Tucker Northrop cleared his throat. "Mrs. Abernathy runs a boarding house for respectable women," he offered. "It's just past the church. Clean place, fair prices." Sarah nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Northrop." As she stepped out into the late afternoon sun, Sarah took a deep breath. Yreka wasn't what she'd expected, but at least she had a direction now. First the general store, then the boarding house. One step at a time, just as she'd been doing since leaving St. Louis. Behind her, she heard the sheriff's voice drift through the still open door. "What really brings you to town, Tucker? Can't just be supplies." "Hired help," came the rancher's reply. "Lost 2 hands last month to that silver strike over in Nevada. Ranch is too much for just me and old Pete to manage." Sarah continued walking, their conversation fading behind her. The general store was easy to find, a large 2-story building with a wide porch and windows displaying everything from boots to bolts of fabric. A bell tinkled as she entered, and a plump woman with graying hair looked up from behind the counter. "Good afternoon," the woman greeted her. "Something I can help you with, Mrs. Wilson?" Sarah ventured. The woman nodded. "That's me. I'm Sarah Fletcher. Sheriff Morgan suggested I speak with you about possible work. I'm a seamstress by trade." Mrs. Wilson's eyes brightened. "Did he now? Well, isn't that fortunate? I've been up to my ears in mending and alterations. My fingers aren't as nimble as they once were." She gestured for Sarah to come closer. "Let me see your hands, girl." Sarah extended her hands, showing the small calluses that marked years of needlework. Mrs. Wilson examined them critically before nodding in approval. "You've done your share of stitching, that's plain enough. I can offer you work 3 days a week to start. Payment will be fair, and if you prove yourself, there might be more. Can you start tomorrow?" Relief washed over Sarah like a cool breeze. "Yes, madam, I can start immediately." "Good. Come by at 8 in the morning." Mrs. Wilson smiled kindly. "Now, do you need anything else? You look like you've traveled some distance." "Just directions to Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house." After getting detailed instructions, Sarah thanked Mrs. Wilson and stepped back onto the street. The day's events had left her exhausted, but a sense of accomplishment lightened her steps as she made her way toward the boarding house. Perhaps Yreka would be the fresh start she so desperately needed. Mrs. Abernathy's establishment was a 2-story clapboard building with a neat garden and freshly painted shutters. The proprietress herself answered the door, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes that seemed to evaluate Sarah's worth in seconds. "Mrs. Abernathy, I'm Sarah Fletcher. I was told you might have a room available." "Who sent you?" The woman's voice was brisk. "Mr. Northrop mentioned your establishment, and Mrs. Wilson from the general store gave me directions." The mention of these names seemed to satisfy Mrs. Abernathy, who stepped back to allow Sarah entry. "I run a respectable house, Miss Fletcher. No gentlemen callers in the rooms, no coming in after 9 o'clock, and no spirits of any kind on the premises. Breakfast is at 6:30, dinner at 6 in the evening. $2 a week, paid in advance." Sarah quickly calculated what remained of her savings. It would be tight, but with the promise of work she could manage. "I understand and agree to your terms." "Very well." Mrs. Abernathy led her up a narrow staircase. "You'll be in room 4. You'll share the washroom with Miss Henderson across the hall. She works at the schoolhouse." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. The window overlooked the street, and Sarah could see the mountains that surrounded Yreka in the distance, turning purple in the fading light. "Thank you," she said, setting her bag on the bed. Mrs. Abernathy nodded curtly. "Dinner's in half an hour, don't be late." With that she departed, closing the door firmly behind her. Alone at last, Sarah sank onto the bed, the events of the day crashing over her. She'd made it. New town, new job, new start. No one knew her here. No one knew what she'd left behind or why she'd fled across half the country. As she unpacked her few belongings, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in months, she felt something akin to hope. The following weeks established a rhythm to Sarah's new life in Yreka. Her work at Mrs. Wilson's proved satisfying, and the older woman seemed pleased with her skill and efficiency. Word spread quickly about the new seamstress in town, and soon Sarah found herself with private commissions as well, mending shirts for miners, altering dresses for the wives of successful businessmen, even crafting a wedding gown for the banker's daughter. Her fellow boarders at Mrs. Abernathy's were pleasant enough company. Besides Miss Henderson, the schoolteacher, there was Mrs. Caldwell, a widow who worked as a laundress, and Miss Parker, who played piano at church functions. The women shared meals and conversation, but Sarah maintained a careful distance, revealing little about her past. It was nearly 3 weeks after her arrival when she encountered Tucker Northrop again. She was leaving the general store, arms laden with fabric for a special order, when she nearly collided with his broad chest. "Mr. Northrop," she exclaimed, stepping back hastily as several bolts of fabric tumbled from her grasp. "Miss Fletcher." He quickly stooped to retrieve the fallen items. "My apologies, I wasn't watching where I was going." "No harm done," she assured him, accepting the fabric he held out to her. "Thank you. You appear to be settling in well," he observed, falling into step beside her as she continued down the street. "I hear Mrs. Wilson sings your praises to anyone who'll listen." Sarah felt a flush of pleasure at his words. "She's been very kind, as has everyone in Yreka." "Not everyone, as I recall," Tucker replied with a slight smile, referring to her first day in town. "Well, almost everyone," she amended, returning his smile. "And you, Mr. Northrop, did you find the hired help you were seeking?" His expression darkened slightly. "Not yet." Good ranch hands are hard to come by these days, especially with rumors of silver and gold drawing men away from honest work. They reached the corner where their paths would diverge, Sarah toward the boarding house, Tucker presumably back to wherever he'd left his horse. "I should be going," Sarah said, suddenly aware they'd been standing in conversation longer than propriety might dictate. "Thank you again for your assistance, Mr. Northrop." "Tucker," he corrected her, the corners of his eyes crinkling as he smiled. "Mr. Northrop makes me feel like my father." "Tucker, then," she agreed, feeling a curious warmth at the informality. "Good day to you." As she continued toward the boarding house, Sarah couldn't help but glance back over her shoulder. Tucker Northrop stood where she'd left him, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. That night at dinner, Miss Henderson mentioned that the town would be holding a social gathering that Saturday to celebrate the completion of the new schoolhouse. "Everyone will be there," she informed the table enthusiastically. "There'll be music and dancing, and Mrs. Peterson is organizing a potluck supper." "Will you attend, Miss Fletcher?" Mrs. Caldwell inquired. Sarah hesitated. She'd been keeping to herself, focusing on work and saving money. A social gathering meant questions, conversations, the risk of revealing too much. "I'm not certain," she replied cautiously. "I have several commissions to complete." "Nonsense," declared Miss Henderson. "All work and no play isn't good for anyone. Besides, it's important to be seen as part of the community." There was wisdom in those words, Sarah had to admit. If she truly wanted to build a new life here, she couldn't remain forever on the periphery. "Perhaps you're right," she conceded. "I'll try to attend at least for a little while." Saturday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Sarah spent the morning finishing a dress for the banker's wife before returning to the boarding house to prepare for the social. She owned only one dress that might be considered suitable for such an occasion, a blue cotton with a modest lace collar that she'd sewn herself before leaving St. Louis. The other women had already departed when Sarah finally made her way toward the newly constructed schoolhouse on the edge of town. She could hear the fiddle music from a distance, along with the hum of voices and laughter. For a moment, she considered turning back, but steeled her resolve and continued forward. The schoolyard was transformed by lanterns strung between trees, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Tables laden with food lined one side, while in the open space before the building, couples were already dancing to the lively tune played by a trio of musicians. Sarah lingered at the edge of the celebration, observing the townsfolk she'd come to recognize over the past weeks. Mrs. Wilson spotted her first, waving enthusiastically and making her way through the crowd. "Sarah, I was beginning to think you wouldn't come," she exclaimed, taking Sarah by the arm. "Come, let me introduce you properly to everyone." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions: the mayor and his wife, the doctor, the blacksmith and his family, merchants and miners and farmers from the surrounding area. Sarah smiled and nodded, trying to commit names to memory while deflecting personal questions with vague responses about back east and seeking opportunities. She was helping herself to a cup of punch when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "I was hoping you'd be here." Sarah turned to find Tucker Northrop standing there, looking quite different from the dust-covered rancher she'd encountered previously. He'd cleaned up well, wearing a dark suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders, his normally unruly hair tamed beneath a respectable hat. "Mr. Northrop Tucker," she corrected herself. "Good evening." "You look lovely, Miss Fletcher," he said with a warmth that made her cheeks flush. "Thank you, and please call me Sarah." He smiled at that, and she noticed again how the expression transformed his weathered face, softening the lines around his eyes. "Would you do me the honor of a dance, Sarah?" he asked, extending his hand. She hesitated only briefly before placing her fingers in his. "I must warn you, it's been some time since I've danced." "Then we'll relearn the steps together," he replied, leading her toward the area where other couples moved in time to the music. Tucker's hand at her waist was warm and steady as he guided her into the dance. Despite her initial nervousness, Sarah found herself relaxing into the rhythm, following his lead as they circled among the other dancers. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, and she couldn't help but smile up at him. "You dance quite well for a cattleman," she observed. He chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly in his chest. "My mother insisted all her sons learn proper social graces, Said no woman would have us otherwise. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was, he agreed, a flicker of sadness crossing his features. She passed 5 years ago. I'm sorry, Sarah said softly. The music shifted to a slower tune and Tucker drew her slightly closer, still maintaining a respectful distance. What about your family, Sarah? Do they remain back east? The question, innocent as it was, caused her smile to falter. I have no family, she replied, the half-truth bitter on her tongue. Tucker studied her face, clearly sensing there was more to the story but didn't press. Well, you found a place here, it seems. Mrs. Wilson can't stop singing your praises. Grateful for the change in subject, Sarah nodded. She's been very kind to me. Everyone has. They danced in comfortable silence for a few moments before Tucker spoke again. I'm heading back to the ranch tomorrow. Been in town all week trying to find hired help with little success. Still no luck then. One man, a drifter named Johnson. Seems capable enough, but I need at least 2 more if we're to handle the herd properly. He sighed. I may have to ride up to Reading next week, try my luck there. The music came to an end, and they joined in the polite applause for the musicians. Tucker kept her hand in his as he led her away from the dance area. Would you care for some refreshment? He asked. Yes, thank you. As they made their way toward the punch bowl, a commotion near the food tables caught their attention. A group of miners had arrived, already well into their cups and were being rather boisterous. Sarah's blood ran cold when she recognized one of them as Porter Miller, the man who had accosted her on her first day in town. Tucker noticed her distress. What is it? Nothing, she said quickly. I just remembered I promised to help Mrs. Wilson with something. Would you excuse me? Before he could respond, Sarah slipped away, making her way through the crowd toward where she'd last seen the storekeeper. She had no desire to encounter Porter Miller again, especially if he was drinking. Mrs. Wilson was engaged in conversation with several other women when Sarah approached. Ah, there you are, my dear. We were just discussing the harvest festival next month. The ladies' auxiliary always creates a special quilt to be auctioned. And with your skill, a loud crash interrupted her, followed by angry shouts. Sarah turned to see that one of the miners had knocked over a table, sending food and dishes clattering to the ground. Sheriff Morgan was already moving toward the disturbance, his expression grim. That's quite enough, gentlemen, the sheriff declared. I think you'd best call it a night. We ain't done celebrating, Porter Miller slurred, his face flushed with drink. Just getting started. Celebration's over for you, Sheriff Morgan replied firmly. Go sleep it off. For a moment, it seemed Porter might argue further, but one of his companions tugged at his arm. Come on, Porter. Plenty of whiskey waiting back at the saloon. Porter's bleary gaze swept the crowd, and Sarah instinctively stepped behind a group of women, hoping to avoid his notice. Unfortunately, the movement caught his attention, and his eyes narrowed as he recognized her. Well, if it ain't the thieving witch, he sneered, pointing an unsteady finger in her direction, still pretending to be all proper and ladylike. Sarah felt the curious stares of the townsfolk turn toward her. Mrs. Wilson stepped forward protectively. That's enough of that talk, Porter Miller. Miss Fletcher is a respectable woman and a valued member of this community. Respectable, Porter laughed harshly. You don't know what she is. And neither do you, came Tucker's voice as he appeared at Sarah's side. His tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. You're drunk, Porter. Go home before you say something you'll regret. Porter swayed slightly, his bloodshot eyes darting between Tucker and Sarah. Defending her honor, are you, Northrop? Better be careful. Women like that. He never finished the sentence. Tucker moved with surprising speed for such a large man, closing the distance to Porter in 2 strides and gripping the front of his shirt. I won't tell you again, Tucker said quietly. The though his words carried in the sudden silence. "Go home." For a tense moment, Sarah feared violence would erupt. Then Porter's bravado seemed to deflate, and he muttered something under his breath as Tucker released him. Sheriff Morgan and another miner escorted the troublemakers away, and gradually, conversation resumed among the gathered townsfolk, though Sarah could feel curious glances directed her way. "I should go," she said quietly to Tucker. "I'm sorry for the disturbance." "You have nothing to apologize for," Tucker assured her. "Porter Miller is a mean drunk and everyone knows it." But Sarah knew the damage had been done. Questions would follow and she wasn't prepared to answer them. "Thank you for the dance," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Good night, Tucker." Before he could protest, she slipped away, making her apologies to Mrs. Wilson before hurrying back toward the boarding house. The cool night air did little to soothe the burning in her cheeks or the tightness in her chest. She'd been foolish to think she could simply start over, that the past wouldn't follow her in some form. Sarah was halfway to Mrs. Abernathy's when she heard footsteps behind her. Alarmed, she quickened her pace, only to hear Tucker's voice call out, "Sarah, wait." She halted, turning reluctantly to face him as he caught up to her. "You shouldn't be walking alone at night," he said, his breathing slightly elevated from his pursuit. "I'm perfectly capable of finding my way," she replied, more sharply than she'd intended. "I don't doubt that," Tucker said patiently, "but I'd feel better seeing you safely to your door." Sarah wanted to refuse, to insist on being left alone with her humiliation, but something in his expression concern without judgment made her relent. "Very well," she sighed. "Thank you." They walked in silence for several moments, the sounds of the celebration fading behind them. It was Tucker who finally spoke. "Porter Miller is a fool," he said quietly. "No one with any sense pays attention to his ramblings." "It's not just Porter," Sarah replied, keeping her gaze fixed ahead. "It's complicated." Tucker was silent for a few more steps. "We all have pasts, Sarah, things we'd rather leave behind." She glanced at him then, curious despite herself. "Even you," a shadow crossed his features. "Especially me." They had reached the boarding house and Sarah paused at the gate. "Thank you for walking me home." Tucker nodded, then hesitated as if wanting to say more. Finally, he simply tipped his hat. "Good night, Sarah." She watched him walk away, his tall figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Inside, the house was quiet, the other boarders still at the social. Sarah made her way to her room, removed her blue dress with trembling fingers and sat heavily on the edge of her bed. Tomorrow, she knew, there would be questions. Whispers. Speculations. In a small town like Yreka, gossip traveled faster than wildfire. She would have to decide whether to stand her ground or move on once again. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. By morning, she had made her decision. After breakfast, she approached Mrs. Wilson at the general store and requested a private word. "My dear, I was so worried when you left so abruptly last night," the older woman fretted. "That dreadful Porter Miller. The sheriff had him locked up until this morning to cool his heels." "Mrs. Wilson," Sarah began hesitantly, "I feel I owe you an explanation." Mrs. Wilson waved a hand dismissively. "You owe me nothing of the sort. We all have histories, child. What matters is who you are now, and you've proven yourself a hard worker and an honest person." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion at the woman's kindness. "Thank you," she managed, "but I've been thinking perhaps it might be better if I moved on." "Nonsense," Mrs. Wilson exclaimed. "Why would you let a drunk like Porter Miller drive you away from a place where you're valued?" "It's not just that," Sarah tried to explain. "I came here for a fresh start, but I'm beginning to think such a thing might not be possible." Mrs. Wilson studied her for a long moment. "Sarah, running from one place to another won't change the past." Whatever you're trying to leave behind, it comes with you in here." She tapped her chest, over her heart. The truth of those words struck Sarah deeply. Hadn't she already discovered that in the months of traveling, moving from town to town? "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Wilson patted her hand sympathetically. "Start by giving Yreka a proper chance. Give us time to know the real Sarah Fletcher. I think you might be surprised by how forgiving people can be." Sarah nodded slowly, not entirely convinced but willing to consider the older woman's advice. "I'll think about it." "Good. Now, there's a stack of mending waiting if you're up to it." Grateful for the normalcy of work, Sarah applied herself diligently throughout the day. There were curious glances from customers who came into the store, but no one mentioned the incident directly, for which she was thankful. It was late afternoon when the bell above the door jingled, and Tucker Northrop stepped inside. Sarah's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending as their eyes met across the store. Mrs. Wilson, noting the exchange, suddenly remembered an urgent matter in the back room, leaving them alone. "I thought you'd be on your way back to your ranch by now," Sarah said, setting aside her work. "I'm leaving shortly," Tucker confirmed. He approached the counter, removing his hat. "I wanted to see you first. If you're concerned about last night, I'm concerned about you," he interrupted gently. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned you were thinking of leaving town." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "She shouldn't have. She cares about you," Tucker said, "as do others in Yreka." "You barely know me," Sarah pointed out. "I'd like to change that." His directness caught her off guard. "I'm riding back to the ranch today, but I'll be returning to town next Saturday for supplies." "Would you consider having dinner with me then?" Sarah stared at him, puzzled by his interest despite the shadow Porter had cast over her reputation. "Why?" Tucker seemed taken aback by the question. "Why would I want to have dinner with you?" "Yes." "After last night, after what Porter said, Sarah," he interrupted gently. "I don't give a damn what Porter Miller thinks or says. I care about what I think, what I see. And what I see is a woman of courage and dignity who deserves to be treated with respect." His words warmed her, even as she maintained her guard. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough to want to know more," he replied simply. "The rest is up to you." Sarah hesitated, torn between caution and the undeniable pull she felt toward this man. I'll consider it." Tucker nodded, seemingly satisfied with that response. "Saturday, then. I'll come by the boarding house at 6 if you decide yes." After he left, Sarah stood motionless, her thoughts in turmoil. Mrs. Wilson returned, a knowing smile on her face. "That's a good man, Tucker Northrop," she commented. "Been through his share of troubles, but came out stronger for it." Sarah's curiosity was piqued despite herself. "What kind of troubles?" Mrs. Wilson considered the question. "Not my story to tell, dear, but I will say this: if anyone might understand the value of a fresh start, it would be Tucker." The week passed with surprising normalcy. The incident at the social seemed to have been largely forgotten, or at least relegated to the background of town gossip in favor of newer developments: the mayor's daughter eloping with a stage coach driver, the discovery of a promising new vein in one of the mines, and the arrival of a traveling theater company scheduled to perform the following month. Sarah found herself increasingly curious about Tucker Northrop. Bits of information came her way through casual conversation. He had inherited his ranch from his father some 8 years prior, was known to be fair in his business dealings, and despite being one of the more eligible bachelors in the county, had never shown serious interest in any of the local women. "Married to that ranch, that one," Mrs. Caldwell commented during dinner at the boarding house. "Though the way he looked at you at the social, Miss Fletcher, might suggest his priorities are changing." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks at the other women's knowing smiles. We barely know each other, she protested. Sometimes that's all it takes, Miss Parker sighed romantically. One look, one dance, and fate is sealed. By Saturday morning, Sarah had changed her mind a dozen times about meeting Tucker for dinner. The practical part of her warned against forming attachments, reminded her of the risks. Yet another part, a part she'd thought long silenced, whispered of possibilities, of connections, of not spending her life in solitary flight. In the end, she decided to accept his invitation, if only to satisfy her curiosity about this man who seemed undeterred by rumors and innuendo. She wore her blue dress again, lacking any better alternative, and waited nervously in the boarding house parlor as the clock approached 6. Mrs. Abernathy, passing through with her ever-present ledger, paused to examine Sarah. "You look very nice, Miss Fletcher," she said with unusual warmth. "Mr. Northrop is a respectable gentleman. I approve of the match." "It's only dinner, Mrs. Abernathy," Sarah clarified hastily. "Not a match of any kind." The older woman's knowing look suggested she thought otherwise, but she merely nodded and continued on her way. Moments later, there was a knock at the front door. Tucker stood on the porch, hat in hand, dressed in what appeared to be his best suit. His eyes lit up when they fell upon Sarah, and she felt a curious flutter in her chest at the admiration in his gaze. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You look quite handsome yourself." He offered his arm, which she took after a moment's hesitation, and led her down the steps. To her surprise, a buggy waited at the curb rather than his horse. "I thought you might prefer this to riding double," he explained, helping her into the seat. "Where are we going?" she asked as he climbed in beside her and took up the reins. "There's a place just outside town, Widow Harper's. Best food in the county, according to most. Thought you might enjoy a meal away from prying eyes." The consideration touched her. "That sounds lovely." The ride was pleasant, the evening mild with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage. Tucker kept the conversation light, telling her about his week at the ranch, the new hand he'd hired, and his plans for the coming season. Sarah found herself relaxing in his company, drawn to his straightforward manner and quiet confidence. Widow Harper's proved to be a small, neat house set back from the road, with a sign in the front yard announcing "Home Cooking by Appointment Only." The widow herself, a sprightly woman in her 60s with bright eyes and a no-nonsense manner, greeted them warmly. "Tucker Northrop, right on time as always," she declared, ushering them inside to a cozy dining room where a single table was set with a white cloth and candles. "And this must be Miss Fletcher. I've heard good things about your needlework, young lady." The meal was indeed exceptional: roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the widow's garden, homemade bread still warm from the oven, and a berry pie that melted in Sarah's mouth. Throughout dinner, conversation flowed easily between them, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd seen, and their shared appreciation for the beauty of the Siskiyou Mountains that surrounded Yreka. It wasn't until they were lingering over coffee that Tucker broached a more personal subject. "May I ask what brought you to California, Sarah? All the way from back east, as you say." Sarah tensed slightly, her fingers tightening around her cup. "I told you, I was seeking a fresh start." Tucker nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Most people who come this far west are. I'm just curious what kind of fresh start you needed that required crossing half the continent alone." Sarah hesitated, torn between her habitual secrecy and a growing desire to trust this man. "It's not a pleasant story," she finally said. "Few of our stories are out here," he replied gently, "but they're ours nonetheless." Taking a deep breath, Sarah decided to offer a portion of the truth. "I was engaged to be married in St. Louis." My fiancé was a banker, well respected in the community, but he was not the man he appeared to be in public. Tucker's expression darkened. Did he hurt you? Not physically, Sarah clarified quickly. But he was controlling, possessive. When I broke our engagement, he was furious. Used his influence to ruin my reputation, to ensure no respectable establishment would hire me. Said things that. She swallowed hard. Let's just say Porter Miller isn't the first man to call me names I don't deserve. Tucker's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. I tried to stay to weather the storm, but it became impossible, so I left. I've been moving west ever since, staying a few weeks or months in a place before moving on. And now Yreka, Tucker said softly. Sarah nodded. And now Yreka. Which seemed perfect until history began repeating itself at the social. Tucker reached across the table, hesitating before gently covering her hand with his. Porter Miller is a drunk with a grudge because you rejected his advances. No one with any sense in this town gives credence to his words. Perhaps, Sarah conceded, but rumors have a way of taking root, growing into beliefs. Only if we let them, Tucker countered. You've earned respect here, Sarah. Through your work, your character, that counts for more than idle gossip in a place like Yreka. She wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that she could stay, build something lasting in this mountain town. And what about you, Tucker? What's your story? A shadow crossed his features. My story, not much to tell. Inherited the ranch from my father, been working it ever since. Mrs. Wilson suggested there was more to it than that, Sarah pressed gently. Tucker was silent for a long moment, his thumb absently tracing circles on the back of her hand. Before I took over the ranch, I rode with a different crowd. Young, reckless. Did things I'm not proud of. He met her eyes directly. I was arrested for robbery when I was 20, spent 2 years in prison. The revelation startled her, though she tried not to show it. I wouldn't have guessed. A rueful smile touched his lips. Good, that was the idea. When I got out, my father was ailing. He gave me a second chance, taught me the ranching business. When he passed, I promised myself I'd honor his faith in me, make something of the legacy he left. And you have, Sarah said softly. I've tried, Tucker agreed, but people have long memories. There are still those in town who look at me and see that wild young fool. Judge me for mistakes I made a decade ago. Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. That's why you weren't quick to judge me. You know what it's like to be defined by your past. We're more than our mistakes, Sarah. More than what others say about us. His gaze held hers intently. The question is whether we believe that ourselves. The ride back to town was quieter, both of them contemplative after the revelations they'd shared. When they arrived at the boarding house, Tucker helped her down from the buggy but didn't immediately release her hand. I've enjoyed this evening, he said. So have I, Sarah admitted. Thank you. Tucker hesitated, then spoke with careful deliberation. I'll be back in town next weekend. If you're still here, I'd like to see you again. The implication was clear. He understood she might choose to move on, to continue her pattern of flight. Sarah studied his face in the moonlight, seeing the openness there, the absence of pressure or demand. I'll be here, she found herself saying. His smile was worth the risk those words represented. Good night, Sarah. Good night, Tucker. As she watched him drive away, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. For the first time since leaving St. Louis, she was making a choice based not on fear, but on possibility. The next morning, Sarah attended the small church on the edge of town, something she hadn't done since arriving in Yreka. She sat quietly in a back pew, finding unexpected peace in the familiar rituals and hymns of her childhood. Several townsfolk nodded greetings, including Mrs. Wilson, who beamed approvingly when she spotted Sarah. After the service, Sarah was making her way out when Sheriff Morgan fell into step beside her. "Miss Fletcher," he greeted her. "Good to see you at service this morning." "Sheriff," she replied cautiously. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all. Just wanted to let you know Porter Miller left town yesterday, headed for the new strike over in Nevada." His eyes twinkled. "Thought you might sleep easier knowing that particular thorn is removed." Relief washed over her. "Thank you for telling me." The sheriff nodded. "Yreka's a good town, Miss Fletcher. Not perfect, mind you, but good people for the most part. Folks who are willing to judge a person on their own merits, given the chance." With that, he tipped his hat and moved on, leaving Sarah to ponder his words as she walked back to the boarding house. The following weeks brought a gradual deepening of Sarah's connection to Yreka and its people. Mrs. Wilson increased her hours at the store as business picked up, and Sarah found herself becoming indispensable as word of her skill with a needle spread throughout the county. She even agreed to help with the quilt for the Harvest Festival, joining the ladies' auxiliary for their weekly sewing circle. Tucker returned to town the following Saturday as promised, and their second dinner at Widow Harper's was even more enjoyable than the first. This time, they lingered afterward, sitting on the widow's porch swing and talking until well past proper calling hours. Sarah found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Ohio, of her parents who had died of fever when she was 17, of her journey to St. Louis to live with an aunt who had since passed. In turn, Tucker told her about growing up on the ranch, about his mother's genteel Southern upbringing that had seemed at odds with frontier life, about his two brothers who had gone east to seek their fortunes during the war. "Do you ever hear from them?" Sarah asked. "Occasionally. James is a lawyer in Chicago now, married with 2 children. Thomas joined the Army, last wrote from a fort in Wyoming Territory." Tucker's expression grew distant. "We were close as boys, but our paths diverged. They never understood why I stayed here after Father died." "Why did you?" Sarah asked softly. Tucker was silent for a long moment. "This land gets in your blood," he finally said. "The mountains, the valleys, the changing seasons. There's a freedom here I never found elsewhere. And a purpose. The ranch isn't just a business, it's a legacy. Something worth building, worth preserving." The passion in his voice moved her. "I'd like to see it someday," she found herself saying. "Your ranch." Tucker's face brightened. "I'd like that too. Perhaps next Sunday if you're free. I could bring the buggy, show you the property." The invitation represented another step forward, another commitment to staying, to building a life here. Sarah found the prospect more exciting than frightening. "I'd enjoy that very much," she replied. The following Sunday dawned clear and mild, perfect for their planned excursion. Tucker arrived promptly at 10, helping Sarah into the buggy with a warm smile that sent her pulse fluttering. "You look lovely," he said, his appreciation evident in his gaze. Sarah smoothed the skirt of her yellow dress, a new creation she'd fashioned from fabric purchased with her growing savings. "Thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing your ranch." The journey took just under an hour, following the main road before turning onto a less traveled trail that wound through pine forest and open meadows. As they crested a hill, Tucker drew the horses to a halt. "There it is," he said with quiet pride. "Northrop Ranch." Below them stretched a verdant valley, bisected by a winding creek. A substantial log house stood near a cluster of outbuildings, while in the distance, cattle grazed peacefully on rolling pastureland. Mountains rose on 3 sides, creating a natural boundary for the property. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, genuinely impressed by the scale and setting. Tucker nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "My father chose well when he staked his claim. Good water, sheltered valleys for winter grazing, enough timber for building and fuel." As they continued down the hill, Sarah noticed signs of hard work and careful management, well-maintained fences, neatly stacked wood piles, a thriving kitchen garden beside the main house. When they pulled up in front of the broad porch, an elderly man emerged from one of the outbuildings. "That's Pete," Tucker explained. "Been with the ranch since my father's time. Practically raised me after Mother died." Pete approached with a curious expression that warmed to welcome when Tucker introduced Sarah. "Miss Fletcher. Heard a lot about you from the boss here," the old man said with a twinkle in his rheumy eyes. "All good things, I hope," Sarah replied, smiling at Tucker's evident embarrassment. "Nothing but," Pete assured her. "About time he brought a lady out to see the place. Been too long on his own, this one." "Pete," Tucker warned, though without heat. The old ranch hand chuckled. "I'll make myself scarce, let you show the lady around proper. Just don't forget we need to move those yearlings to the north pasture before sundown." As Pete ambled away, Tucker offered Sarah his arm. "Let me show you the house first." The main building was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a two-story structure built of substantial logs with a wide porch wrapping around three sides. Inside, Sarah found rooms that were functional rather than fancy, but surprisingly comfortable. The large stone fireplace in the main room was flanked by well-worn leather chairs, and a sofa covered with a colorful woven blanket. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with an eclectic collection that spoke of varied interests. "Your mother's influence?" Sarah asked, noting several volumes of poetry among the practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry. Tucker nodded, pleased by her observation. "She believed education shouldn't stop just because we lived miles from the nearest school. She taught us herself until we were old enough to go to town for proper schooling." The kitchen was spacious, designed for practicality with a large wood stove, ample work surfaces, and rows of preserves on shelves. A round oak table occupied the center, large enough to seat several people. "Pete and I take turns cooking," Tucker explained. "Neither of us is particularly skilled, but we manage not to starve." "It's a fine kitchen," Sarah replied. "Good bones, as my mother would have said." Upstairs, Tucker showed her several bedrooms, most sparsely furnished, before pausing at a door at the end of the hall. "This was my parents' room," he said. "I've never used it. Seems more fitting to keep my father's study as my bedroom." Sarah understood the sentiment. Some spaces retained the essence of those who had occupied them, became almost sacred in their absence. After touring the house, Tucker showed her the barn, the blacksmith shop, and the smokehouse. Everywhere, Sarah noted the same attention to detail, the same care in maintenance. This was a working ranch, but also a home that had been loved and tended for generations. As the afternoon progressed, they walked along the creek that ran behind the house, eventually settling on a flat rock overlooking a small pool where trout could be seen darting in the clear water. "What do you think?" Tucker asked after a comfortable silence. "I think you've built something wonderful here," Sarah replied honestly, "something to be proud of." Tucker's gaze was warm as it rested on her face. "Thank you. That means more than you might know." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Sarah found herself wondering what it might be like to be part of this place, to wake each morning to the vista of mountains and meadows, to share in the rhythms of ranch life. As if reading her thoughts, Tucker reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "Sarah, I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel," a shout from the direction of the house interrupted him. Pete was waving from the porch, pointing toward the setting sun. Tucker sighed, regret evident in his expression. "Those yearlings won't move themselves, I'm afraid." "Of course," Sarah said, rising from the rock. "You have responsibilities." "I do," he agreed, helping her to her feet but not immediately releasing her hand. "But this conversation isn't finished." The ride back to town was companionable, filled with talk of the ranch and Tucker's plans for its future. By the time they reached the boarding house, night had fallen, and Sarah was reluctant for the day to end. "Thank you for showing me your home," she said as Tucker helped her down from the buggy. "Thank you for coming," he replied, his voice low. Sarah, Mrs. Abernathy's silhouette appeared in the doorway of the boarding house, a not-so-subtle reminder of proper decorum and curfews. Tucker chuckled softly. "I should let you go inside before Mrs. Abernathy decides I'm not a suitable caller for her establishment. When will you be back in town?" Sarah asked. "Thursday, for the Cattlemen's Association meeting," Tucker replied. "May I call on you then?" Sarah nodded, her heart lightening at the prospect. "I'd like that very much." The following days passed in a blur of activity as preparations for the Harvest Festival intensified. Sarah found herself swept up in the excitement, working extended hours on the auction quilt while also completing several special orders for festival attire. The work was satisfying, but her thoughts often drifted to Tucker and the interrupted moment by the creek. Thursday arrived with an unexpected complication, a heavy rainstorm that turned Yreka's streets to mud and made travel difficult. Sarah worked at the general store, glancing occasionally at the window as raindrops lashed against the glass, wondering if Tucker would brave the weather to keep their appointment. By closing time, there had been no sign of him, and Sarah tried to quell her disappointment as she helped Mrs. Wilson secure the store for the night. She had just locked the front door when she heard the splash of hooves in the muddy street. Turning, she saw Tucker dismounting from his horse, his slicker glistening with rain. "Tucker, you shouldn't have come in this weather," she exclaimed, hurrying to meet him under the store's awning. "And miss seeing you," he smiled, removing his dripping hat. "Not a chance." Mrs. Wilson, observing their reunion, made a show of suddenly remembering an errand. "I must check on poor Mrs. Johnson. Her rheumatism always acts up in this damp. Sarah, dear, would you mind closing up? Just slide the key under the door when you're done." Before either could protest, the storekeeper had bustled away, leaving them alone in the sheltered entryway. "She's not very subtle, is she?" Tucker observed with amusement. "Not in the least," Sarah agreed, though she couldn't help feeling grateful for the older woman's maneuvering. "Come inside before you catch your death." In the cozy interior of the store, Tucker removed his wet slicker while Sarah lit a lamp, casting a warm glow over the familiar space. Rain drummed steadily on the roof, creating a sense of intimacy as they settled into chairs near the small stove that Mrs. Wilson kept burning on chilly days. "The cattlemen's meeting was canceled," Tucker explained. "Most of the ranchers couldn't make it into town with the creeks rising, but I was already halfway here when I got the news." "I'm glad you came," Sarah said softly, "though I worry about your journey back." "I've arranged a room at the hotel," he assured her. "I'm not foolish enough to attempt that trail in the dark during a downpour." Relief flooded her. "Good. I wouldn't want you taking unnecessary risks." Tucker's expression grew serious. "Sarah, about what I was going to say at the ranch on Sunday," a loud crack of thunder interrupted him, followed by a momentary flickering of the lamp. Sarah jumped slightly at the sound, and Tucker instinctively reached for her hand. "Just thunder," he said gently. "Though it sounds like the storm's getting worse." Sarah nodded, acutely aware of his warm fingers wrapped around hers. "You were saying—" Tucker's thumb traced small circles on her palm, sending tingles up her arm. "I was going to say that even though we haven't known each other long, I've come to care for you deeply. More than I expected, more quickly than I thought possible." Sarah's heart raced at his words. "Tucker, please let me finish," he requested softly. "I know you came to Yreka seeking a fresh start, carrying burdens from your past. I understand that God knows I have my own, but I believe sometimes life offers us unexpected chances, opportunities we'd be fools to ignore." He took a deep breath, his blue eyes intent on hers. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments you're not ready to give. I'm just asking for a chance for us to see where this might lead." The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. For so long, Sarah had been running, protecting herself, keeping others at a safe distance. But in this man, this kind, honest, hard-working rancher, she sensed something different, something worth the risk of opening her heart. "I care for you too, Tucker," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the rain. "More than I thought I could care for anyone again, but I'm afraid." "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of believing in something that might not last, of being hurt again, of—" she hesitated, "of not being enough." Tucker's expression softened. "Sarah, you are more than enough. You're everything I never knew I was looking for until you stepped off that stagecoach." Before she could respond, he leaned forward and brushed his lips against hers, a tentative kiss that asked permission, even as it expressed tenderness. Sarah found herself responding, her free hand rising to rest against his chest, as the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing, of possibility, of a future neither had anticipated. When they finally parted, Sarah remained close, their foreheads touching as rain continued to patter against the window. "I should walk you back to the boarding house before Mrs. Abernathy sends out a search party," Tucker murmured, though he made no move to release her. "Probably," Sarah agreed, equally reluctant to end the moment. Eventually, practicality prevailed. Tucker retrieved his still damp slicker while Sarah extinguished the lamp and secured the store. They stepped out into the rain, which had subsided to a gentle drizzle, and made their way through the muddy streets to Mrs. Abernathy's, huddled together beneath Tucker's slicker. At the boarding house steps, Tucker pulled her close once more. "May I call on you tomorrow evening, properly with Mrs. Abernathy's approval?" Sarah nodded, happiness bubbling within her like a spring. "I'd like that very much." His smile was warm as he kissed her once more, briefly but with unmistakable promise, before watching her enter the boarding house. Inside, Sarah leaned against the closed door, her fingers touching her lips where the warmth of Tucker's kiss lingered. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt not just hope, but joy, a lightness of spirit that made the future seem bright with possibility rather than shadowed by fear. The days leading up to the Harvest Festival flew by in a whirl of preparations and stolen moments with Tucker. True to his word, he called formally at the boarding house, enduring Mrs. Abernathy's scrutiny with good humor. They took walks through town, attended church together on Sunday, and shared quiet conversations on the boarding house porch under the watchful eye of the proprietress. With each passing day, Sarah found herself growing more attached to both Tucker and Yreka itself. The town that had initially been just another stopping point was becoming home, its people no longer strangers but friends and neighbors. She threw herself into festival preparations with enthusiasm, working alongside other women who now greeted her by name and included her in their conversations and plans. The night before the festival, Tucker invited her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the finest establishment in Yreka, with white tablecloths and a proper menu. Sarah wore a new dress she'd made especially for the occasion, a deep green that complemented her auburn hair. "You take my breath away," Tucker said when he met her at the boarding house, his admiration evident in his gaze. The restaurant was crowded with visitors who had come to town for the festival, but Tucker had secured a table in a quiet corner. As they dined on the hotel's specialties, venison steak for Tucker, trout for Sarah, she noticed several people casting curious glances their way. "We seem to be attracting attention," she observed. Tucker smiled. That's what happens when the most beautiful woman in town agrees to dine with a humble rancher. Sarah blushed at the compliment but shook her head. I think it's more than that. We've become a topic of conversation, haven't we? Perhaps, Tucker conceded. Small towns run on gossip, you know that, but it's mostly benign curiosity, I assure you. And the rest, Sarah pressed. Tucker considered his response carefully. There will always be those who cling to past judgments, Sarah. People who can't see beyond their own narrow perspectives. But they don't matter, not to me, and they shouldn't to you. His hand found hers across the table, squeezing gently. What matters is what we know to be true, about ourselves, about each other. Sarah nodded, drawing strength from his confidence. You're right. Besides, he added with a twinkle in his eye, half the men in this room are envious that I'm dining with you, and the other half are wondering how I managed to convince you to accept my company. She laughed at that, the tension easing from her shoulders. You're ridiculous. Perhaps, he agreed cheerfully, but you're still here, so I must be doing something right. After dinner, they walked slowly through town, enjoying the crisp autumn evening. Preparations for the festival were visible everywhere, bunting and harvest decorations adorning storefronts, stands being erected in the town square, wagons unloading produce and goods for the following day's displays. It's going to be quite an event, Sarah observed. The Harvest Festival is Yreka's biggest celebration, Tucker explained. People come from all over the county. There'll be contests, music, dancing, and the auction, of course. The quilt turned out beautifully, Sarah said, thinking of the intricate pattern the ladies' auxiliary had created. I hope it raises a good sum for the school. They had reached the boarding house, and Tucker turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Sarah, there's something I want to ask you. Her heart quickened at his serious tone. Yes, tomorrow at the festival would you stand with me? As my girl, he smiled self-consciously. I know it sounds old-fashioned, but in a place like Yreka it matters. It means something. Sarah understood what he was asking, a public declaration of their relationship, a statement to the town that they were courting officially. It was a significant step, one that would put an end to speculation and make clear their intentions toward each other. I would be honored to stand with you, Tucker, she replied softly. His smile was radiant as he bent to kiss her, a gentle but thorough kiss that left her breathless. Until tomorrow, then. The Harvest Festival dawned bright and clear, the recent rains having washed the world clean and brought out the vivid autumn colors of the surrounding mountains. Sarah spent the morning helping with final preparations, setting up the display of handicrafts and baked goods that would be judged and later auctioned for charity. Mrs. Wilson had given her the afternoon off, encouraging her to enjoy the festivities. You've worked hard enough, my dear. Time for some pleasure. As arranged, Tucker met her at the boarding house at noon, looking handsome in a new shirt and his best vest. Sarah took his offered arm, and together they made their way to the town square where the festival was in full swing. The transformation was remarkable, colorful bunting strung between buildings, tables laden with harvest bounty, stands offering everything from apple cider to handcrafted toys. Children darted about, faces sticky with candy, while a band played lively tunes from a hastily constructed stage. As they moved through the crowd, Sarah was acutely aware of the glances and whispers that followed them. But where once such attention would have filled her with dread, she now found herself standing taller, secure in Tucker's steadfast presence at her side. When they encountered friends and acquaintances, Tucker introduced her proudly as my girl, Miss Sarah Fletcher, his voice warm with affection. The day passed in a blur of activities, watching the pie-eating contest, which the blacksmith's apprentice won handily, applauding the children's choir, admiring the displays of produce and livestock. Tucker kept Sarah's hand firmly in his, occasionally bringing it to his lips when he thought no one was looking, sending delicious shivers down her spine. Late in the afternoon came the auction, the highlight of the festival. Sheriff Morgan, serving as auctioneer, had a natural talent for cajoling higher bids from the crowd. Sarah held her breath when the quilt she had helped create was presented, pleased when it fetched a substantial sum from the banker's wife. "And now, ladies and gentlemen," the sheriff announced, "we have a special item, a custom suit of clothes, to be tailored by our own Miss Sarah Fletcher, whose skill with needle and thread has become legendary in these parts." Sarah gasped in surprise. This hadn't been part of the planned auction items. She glanced questioningly at Mrs. Wilson, who stood nearby with a satisfied smile. "The winner will receive one suit or dress made to their specifications," Sheriff Morgan continued. "Do I hear an opening bid of $5? The bidding began in earnest, quickly surpassing $10 and climbing higher. Sarah watched in amazement as several gentlemen competed for the prize, driving the price up to $20, a substantial sum for custom clothing, even of the finest quality. "25, came Tucker's voice beside her, causing heads to turn. "30, countered a voice from the back of the crowd, a well-dressed stranger whom Sarah didn't recognize. Tucker's jaw tightened. "35. 40, the stranger replied smoothly, stepping forward. The crowd murmured with excitement at the escalating bids. Sheriff Morgan was clearly enjoying the competition, his eyes twinkling as he glanced between the two men. $40 from Mr. James Harrington of San Francisco, he announced. "Do I hear more?" Tucker hesitated and Sarah squeezed his hand. "It's all right," she whispered. "It's for charity after all." But Tucker shook his head, determination in his eyes. $50, he declared firmly. A hush fell over the crowd at the unprecedented amount. Mr. Harrington considered for a moment, then shrugged elegantly and stepped back. $50 going once, going twice. Sold to Mr. Tucker Northrop. Sheriff Morgan brought down his gavel with a flourish. "And I believe that concludes our auction for this year." A record total for the school fund. As the crowd dispersed, heading toward the area where tables were being set up for the community supper, the well-dressed stranger approached Sarah and Tucker. "My congratulations, sir," he said, extending his hand to Tucker. "You certainly wanted that custom suit more than I did." Tucker shook the offered hand, his expression guarded. "Mr. Harrington, was it?" "James Harrington, yes, representing Western Union Telegraph Company." He turned to Sarah with a polite bow. "And you must be the talented Miss Fletcher whose work is worth such a princely sum." "You're too kind, Mr. Harrington," Sarah replied, uncomfortable under his appraising gaze. "Not at all. In fact, I'd be interested in discussing a commission with you if you're available. My wife is accompanying me on this trip, and when she heard about your skill with a needle, Miss Fletcher has a considerable waiting list for her services." Tucker interrupted smoothly. "But I'm sure Mrs. Wilson at the general store would be happy to discuss scheduling possibilities with your wife." Harrington's eyes flickered between them, a knowing smile touching his lips. "I see. Well, I wouldn't want to intrude further on your celebration. Good evening to you both." As he walked away, Sarah turned to Tucker with raised eyebrows. "That was rather territorial of you." Tucker had the grace to look sheepish. "Was it? I didn't care for the way he was looking at you. And how was that?" "Like you were another item up for auction," Tucker muttered. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "Tucker Northrop, I do believe you're jealous." "Not jealous," he corrected, drawing her away from the dispersing crowd toward a quieter corner of the square. "Protective. There's a difference." "Is there?" she teased. His expression softened as he gazed down at her. Sarah, you have no idea what you mean to me, do you? The humor faded from her face at his serious tone. Tell me, she said softly. Tucker took a deep breath. I had planned to wait to do this properly, but today seeing you here, part of this community, watching everyone finally recognize what I've known since the moment I met you. He took her hands in his. Sarah Fletcher, I love you. I think I've been looking for you all my life without knowing it until you appeared. Sarah's heart seemed to stop, then race forward, his words touching something deep within her that had been wounded, dormant, afraid to hope. Tears stung her eyes as emotions she'd kept carefully guarded broke free. No one has ever wanted me, she whispered, the admission painful even as it freed her. Not really, not for myself. Tucker's hands tightened on hers. I've been looking for you all my life, he repeated firmly. And now that I've found you, I never want to let you go. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. This was my mother's, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl. I know it's soon, perhaps too soon by conventional standards. But I'm asking you, Sarah Fletcher, if you would do me the honor of becoming my wife. Sarah stared at the ring, then at Tucker's earnest face, her mind whirling with the suddenness of it all. Yet in her heart she recognized the truth of her feelings, the certainty that had been growing with each day spent in his company. Yes, she whispered, and then more strongly, yes, Tucker, I will marry you. His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace that drew cheers from several onlookers who had witnessed the proposal. She said yes. Tucker announced proudly to anyone within earshot, causing more applause and congratulations to flow their way. Mrs. Wilson appeared, beaming with satisfaction. About time you asked her, Tucker Northrop. I was beginning to think you'd never work up the courage. You knew? Sarah asked, surprised. Of course I knew. He came to see me last week, asking my blessing since you have no family here, as if I'd say anything but yes. The storekeeper hugged them both. Now come along to the supper, you two. Everyone will want to congratulate you properly. The community supper became an impromptu engagement celebration, as news of their betrothal spread through the gathering. Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers, accepted and embraced by the town in a way she had never anticipated when she first arrived. When will the wedding be, Mrs. Abernathy inquired, practical as always. Sarah looked to Tucker, who smiled tenderly. As soon as Sarah is ready, he replied. Though with winter approaching, spring might be more practical. Spring weddings are lovely, Miss Henderson sighed romantically. All those fresh flowers. As the evening wore on, with music and dancing under the stars, Sarah found herself in a moment of quiet reflection, watching Tucker across the square as he spoke with Sheriff Morgan and several other men. Catching her eye, he excused himself and came to her side. Happy? He asked, slipping an arm around her waist. Sarah leaned into his strength, marveling at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened woman fleeing her past to a bride to be surrounded by a community that had become family, it seemed almost too much to believe. More than I ever thought possible, she admitted. Tucker, are you sure? About me, about us? His answer was to kiss her, there in front of the entire town, a kiss that spoke of devotion and promise and a future bright with shared dreams. Does that answer your question? He murmured when they finally parted. Sarah laughed, joy bubbling up from a well she had thought long dry. I believe it does. The months leading up to their spring wedding passed in a whirl of preparations and planning. Sarah continued her work at the general store while also readying herself for life as a rancher's wife. Mrs. Wilson and the other women of Yreka took her under their collective wing, sharing recipes and household tips, teaching her the skills she would need in her new role. Tucker rode into town at least once a week, often staying overnight at the hotel so they could spend time together. They worked with the minister to plan their ceremony, chose furnishings for the ranch house, and dreamed of their future together. Winter brought snow to the mountains surrounding Yreka, making travel difficult but not impossible. On Christmas Eve, Tucker surprised Sarah by arriving unexpectedly at the boarding house, his coat covered in snow, bearing gifts for her and her fellow boarders. "I couldn't let you spend Christmas alone," he explained as they sat by the fire in Mrs. Abernathy's parlor, other residents discreetly giving them some privacy. "I wouldn't have been alone," Sarah pointed out, gesturing to the festive decorations and the sounds of the other women preparing for the holiday meal in the kitchen. "Without me, then," Tucker amended with a smile. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package. "I have something for you." An early wedding present. Sarah unwrapped the paper to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a miniature portrait of Tucker, his likeness captured by a traveling photographer who had visited Yreka in the autumn. "So you can keep me close to your heart until we're together permanently," he explained. "It's beautiful," she whispered, deeply touched by the sentiment. "Help me put it on." As Tucker fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers lingering warmly on her skin, Sarah marveled at the depth of feeling that had grown between them in just a few short months. What had begun as cautious attraction had blossomed into a love that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. "I have something for you as well," she said, retrieving a package from beneath the small tree in the corner of the parlor. Tucker unwrapped it carefully to reveal a hand-knitted scarf in rich blue wool that matched his eyes, along with a pair of leather gloves she had commissioned from the town's cobbler, lined with rabbit fur for warmth. "Sarah, these are perfect," he said, clearly moved by the thoughtful gifts. "The women at the sewing circle helped me with the scarf," she admitted. "I'm still learning." "It's wonderful because you made it," Tucker assured her, wrapping it around his neck immediately. "I'll think of you every time I wear it." Christmas Day brought a gathering at the church, followed by dinner at Widow Harper's, who had insisted on hosting them. Tucker remained in town for 3 days before the weather cleared enough for him to return to the ranch, promising to be back for New Year's if the passes remained open. As winter deepened, Sarah began packing her belongings in preparation for the move to the ranch after their wedding. Her meager possessions from St. Louis had grown gifts from the women of Yreka, fabrics and notions for her sewing, books Tucker had brought her on his visits to town. Mrs. Wilson had already found a replacement to take over Sarah's duties at the store, a young widow with 2 children who had recently moved to town. Sarah spent January training her successor, ensuring a smooth transition while also completing the wedding dress she was creating from ivory silk, ordered specially from San Francisco. February brought preparations for the ceremony itself. The wedding would be held in Yreka's church, followed by a reception at the hotel. Tucker's brothers had written to confirm their attendance, traveling from Chicago and Wyoming for the occasion. Sarah, having no family of her own, had asked Sheriff Morgan to give her away, a request he accepted with unexpected emotion, confessing that he'd never had the chance to walk a daughter down the aisle. March arrived with the first signs of spring wildflowers appearing in the meadows around Yreka, trees budding, days growing longer and warmer. Sarah's excitement built as the wedding date approached, tempered only by occasional moments of disbelief that such happiness could really be hers. One evening, a week before the wedding, Tucker arrived at the boarding house looking unusually serious. "Can we talk privately?" he asked after greeting her with a kiss. Mrs. Abernathy, ever vigilant but increasingly lenient as the wedding approached, allowed them use of the parlor with the door left partially open. "What is it?" Sarah asked once they were seated, concern creeping into her voice. "Has something happened?" Tucker took her hands in his. "I received a letter today from St. Louis." Sarah's heart froze. "From St. Louis?" "Who?" "A lawyer named Harrison," Tucker continued, "representing Edward Blackburn." The name sent a chill through Sarah's body. Edward, her former fiancé, the man whose cruelty and lies had driven her from her home. "How did he find me?" she whispered. "The letter doesn't say," Tucker replied, his thumb stroking the back of her hand soothingly. "But it seems Mr. Blackburn has been tracking your movements for some time. He learned of our engagement through a newspaper announcement that was picked up by wire services." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting the wave of fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "What does he want?" "According to his lawyer, he claims you took certain items belonging to him when you left family jewelry, papers of value. He demands their return and threatens legal action if you refuse." "That's a lie," Sarah said firmly, opening her eyes to meet Tucker's gaze. "I took nothing that wasn't mine. The only jewelry I had was a cameo brooch that had belonged to my mother, which I sold in Denver when my funds were running low." Tucker nodded, his expression relieved though not surprised. "I believed as much. But Sarah, there's more. The letter suggests. It suggests that if you don't comply with his demands, Mr. Blackburn is prepared to make certain allegations public. Allegations that would damage your reputation." Anger flared within Sarah, burning away the initial fear. More lies. Is there no end to his vindictiveness? "Apparently not," Tucker said grimly. "But Sarah, I want you to know that nothing in this letter changes anything between us. I don't care what Blackburn says or threatens. I love you, and I'm going to marry you in 1 week's time, come hell or high water." The fierce protectiveness in his voice steadied her. "What will you do about the letter?" "I've already sent a telegram to my brother James in Chicago. As a lawyer, he'll know how to handle this properly. In the meantime, I've written back to Harrison making it clear that any further communication should be directed to me, not to you, and that any false allegations will be met with legal action of our own." Relief washed over Sarah at his calm, decisive approach. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for standing by me." Tucker gathered her close, his arms strong and sure around her. "Always, Sarah, always." The threat from St. Louis cast a brief shadow over the final days before the wedding. But Tucker's unwavering support and the practical steps he had taken helped Sarah regain her equilibrium. When a telegram arrived from James Northrop confirming that he had initiated contact with Blackburn's lawyer and was handling the situation, the last of her anxiety faded. Their wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and new blossoms. Sarah, dressed in her beautiful ivory gown, assisted by Mrs. Wilson and Miss Henderson, who had become dear friends. The silk flowed gracefully around her figure, the bodice adorned with delicate lace she had stitched by hand during the long winter evenings. "You look absolutely radiant, my dear," Mrs. Wilson declared, tears glistening in her eyes as she arranged Sarah's veil. "Tucker won't be able to speak when he sees you." A knock at the door revealed Sheriff Morgan, resplendent in his best suit, a flower pinned to his lapel. He paused in the doorway, his weathered face softening with emotion. "Miss Fletcher," he said, clearing his throat, "it would be my honor to escort you to the church." The walk through town was like a dream. Townsfolk lined the streets, calling out congratulations and well wishes. Flowers had been strewn along the path to the church, where Tucker waited with the minister, his brothers standing as his groomsmen. When the church doors opened, and Sarah appeared on Sheriff Morgan's arm, A hush fell over the assembled guests. Tucker, standing tall and handsome at the altar, visibly caught his breath, his eyes never leaving her face as she made her way down the aisle. "Who gives this woman in marriage?" the minister asked when they reached the altar. "On behalf of the town of Yreka, I do," Sheriff Morgan replied, his voice carrying clearly through the church before he placed Sarah's hand in Tucker's. The ceremony itself was a blur of emotion for Sarah, the traditional vows spoken with conviction, the exchange of rings, Tucker's steady gaze holding hers throughout. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Tucker's kiss was both tender and possessive, drawing approving murmurs and a few good-natured cheers from the congregation. The celebration that followed at the hotel was joyous and extended well into the evening. Sarah was introduced to Tucker's brothers James, the serious lawyer from Chicago with his elegant wife, and Thomas, the uniformed army officer whose resemblance to Tucker was striking. "He's been telling us about you in every letter for months," Thomas confided to Sarah during a quiet moment. "I've never seen my brother so thoroughly smitten." "I hope I can live up to his expectations," Sarah replied, watching as Tucker conversed with some of the ranchers across the room. "From what I can see, you've exceeded them," Thomas assured her with a warm smile. "Welcome to the family, Sarah." As the evening drew to a close, Tucker and Sarah said their farewells amid a shower of rice and good wishes. A buggy waited to take them to the ranch, their home now decorated with ribbons and flowers by the townspeople. The journey passed in comfortable silence, Sarah nestled against Tucker's side, both of them content to savor the moment without words. When they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, Tucker drew the horses to a halt, just as he had on her first visit. "Welcome home, Mrs. Northrop," he said softly. Sarah gazed at the valley below, now familiar and dear to her, the lights of the ranch house glowing welcomingly in the gathering dusk. "Home," she repeated, the word filled with wonder. After so long without roots, without belonging, she had found her place in the world with this man in this beautiful valley. Tucker's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Having second thoughts?" he teased gently. Sarah turned to him, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. "Only about waiting so long to say yes." His laugh was joyous as he urged the horses forward, down the slope toward their future together. The first months of married life brought adjustments for both Sarah and Tucker as they established their rhythm as a couple. Sarah learned the daily routines of the ranch, taking over management of the household while also continuing her sewing for select clients in town. Tucker, accustomed to bachelor habits, adapted to sharing his space and his decisions with a partner. Pete, the old ranch hand, proved an unexpected ally for Sarah, showing her the particulars of ranch management with patience and good humor. "Been waiting years for the boss to find himself a good woman," he confided. "Place needs a woman's touch, always has." With Sarah's influence, the ranch house gradually transformed. Curtains appeared at windows that had been bare for years, colorful quilts brightened the beds, and the kitchen became a warm, inviting space where meals were shared and plans discussed. Tucker encouraged her to make whatever changes she felt necessary, delighting in the way she made the house truly their home. Summer brought the busiest season on the ranch, calves to brand, hay to cut and store, endless maintenance of fences and buildings in preparation for the coming winter. Sarah threw herself into the work alongside Tucker, learning to ride better, to help with the garden that provided much of their food, to preserve fruits and vegetables for the months when fresh produce would be scarce. Their trips to town became special occasions, chances to reconnect with friends and catch up on news. Mrs. Wilson always welcomed Sarah warmly at the general store, eager to hear about life at the ranch. Sheriff Morgan made a point of stopping to chat whenever they were in Yreka, and Mrs. Abernathy invited them for Sunday dinner at the boarding house once a month. In late August, just as the first hints of autumn were touching the highest mountain slopes, Sarah received a letter from James Northrop in Chicago. The matter with Edward Blackburn had been resolved, he wrote. Faced with the prospect of counter-litigation, and the evidence James had gathered of Blackburn's previous unethical behavior, the banker had withdrawn his claims and signed a document agreeing to cease all contact or face serious legal consequences. "You needn't worry about Mr. Blackburn again," James assured her. "Some men only understand the language of power and consequences, and he has been made to understand quite clearly." Relief washed over Sarah as she shared the news with Tucker. "It feels like the last shadow from my past has finally been lifted," she said as they sat on the porch swing in the evening coolness. Tucker's arm tightened around her shoulders. "You're safe here, Sarah. This is your home now, your life. Nothing from the past can touch you." She leaned into his embrace, marveling at how completely her life had changed in just 1 year. From a frightened woman fleeing across the country to a confident rancher's wife, secure in her husband's love and her place in the community. "I have news as well," she said after a moment of comfortable silence. "News I've been waiting to be certain of before sharing." Tucker turned to look at her, curiosity in his eyes. "What kind of news?" Sarah took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen, still flat, but containing the secret she had suspected for several weeks. "We're going to have a baby, Tucker, in early spring." His expression transformed from confusion to wonder to pure joy in the span of seconds. "A baby, you're sure?" Sarah nodded, happiness bubbling up inside her at his reaction. "Dr. Winters confirmed it when we were in town yesterday. I wanted to be certain before telling you." Tucker whooped with delight, lifting her from the swing and spinning her in a circle before setting her down carefully. "A baby," he repeated, awe in his voice as he placed his hand once more on her stomach. "Our child." The news of the coming baby spread quickly through the ranch and into Yreka. Mrs. Wilson immediately began planning a quilting bee to create a special blanket for the infant. Sheriff Morgan, in an unexpected display of sentimentality, presented them with a finely crafted wooden cradle that he had apparently commissioned from the town's carpenter weeks earlier. "Had a feeling," was all he would say when Sarah expressed surprise at his foresight. As autumn deepened into winter, Sarah's body changed, her slender form rounding with the new life growing within. Tucker became even more protective, insisting she rest more, hiring a woman from town to help with the heavier household tasks, watching her with a tenderness that sometimes brought tears to her eyes. "I'm not an invalid, you know," she protested one evening as he took the mending from her hands and insisted she put her feet up. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "Not my woman," Tucker replied with a grin. "Not my baby. Indulge me, Sarah." She couldn't argue with that, nor with the loving concern behind his hovering. Truth be told, she enjoyed being pampered, especially as the winter progressed and her energy waned with her advancing pregnancy. Christmas was especially meaningful that year, their first as husband and wife, their last before becoming parents. They decorated the ranch house with pine boughs and ribbons, invited Pete to join them for a special dinner, and exchanged thoughtful gifts. Tucker presented Sarah with a beautiful rocking chair for the nursery, while she gave him a handcrafted album containing photographs and mementos of their courtship and wedding. January brought heavy snowfalls that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Tucker kept a path cleared to the main road and made sure they had ample supplies, but trips to town became rare. Sarah used the quiet time to prepare for the baby, sewing tiny garments, reading the books on childbirth and infant care that Mrs. Wilson had lent her, and talking to Tucker about their hopes and dreams for their child. "What shall we name him?" Tucker asked one evening as they sat by the fire, his hand resting on her now prominent belly. "Him? So certain it's a boy," Sarah teased. "Just a feeling," he replied with a smile. "A son to carry on the Northrop name, to learn the ranching business. And if it's a daughter," Tucker's expression softened, "then she'll be as beautiful and strong as her mother, and I'll be wrapped around her little finger from the moment she's born." They discussed names for both possibilities, finally settling on William James for a boy, after Tucker's father and brother, and Elizabeth Rose for a girl, combining the names of Sarah's mother and Tucker's. February passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Dr. Winters rode out to the ranch twice to check on Sarah's progress, pronouncing her healthy and the baby well-positioned. Mrs. Wilson sent regular packages with the mail carrier baby clothes contributed by the ladies of Yreka. Preserves and tonics, she insisted, would strengthen Sarah for the birth. Letters full of advice and encouragement. March arrived with milder weather, and the first signs of spring snowdrops pushing through the retreating snow, longer days, the return of birds from their winter migration. Sarah's time was near, and Tucker arranged for the doctor's wife, an experienced midwife, to stay at the ranch until the baby arrived. The labor began on a clear morning in late March, just as the sun was cresting the eastern mountains. Sarah woke Tucker with a hand on his shoulder and a calm announcement. "It's time." What followed was 18 hours of the hardest work Sarah had ever done, supported by Mrs. Winters' capable assistance and Tucker's steadfast presence. He refused to be banished to the traditional male waiting place, insisting on staying by Sarah's side throughout, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement through each contraction. As twilight settled over the ranch, with the first stars appearing in the deepening blue sky, William James Northrop made his entrance into the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to his father's eyes. "A son," Tucker whispered, his voice thick with emotion as Mrs. Winters placed the swaddled infant in Sarah's arms. "Sarah, you did it. You're amazing." Exhausted but radiant, Sarah gazed down at their child-perfect tiny features, a dusting of dark hair, miniature fingers that curled reflexively around her finger when she touched his palm. "Hello, William," she murmured. "We've been waiting for you." Mrs. Winters efficiently completed her tasks, ensuring both mother and baby were clean and comfortable before discreetly leaving the new family alone together. Tucker settled carefully on the edge of the bed, one arm around Sarah's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's head. "Thank you," he said softly, pressing a kiss to Sarah's temple. "For him, for us, for everything." Sarah leaned into his strength, marveling at the perfect completeness of the moment this man she loved, this child they had created, this home they had built together. From the depths of her memory came the words she had whispered to Tucker that day at the Harvest Festival, words that seemed a lifetime ago. "No one has ever wanted me." How wrong she had been. How beautifully, wonderfully wrong. "I love you," she said simply, tilting her face up to his. Tucker's kiss was tender, filled with all the emotions too profound for words. "And I love you, Sarah Northrop. Always have, from the moment I saw you, always will until my last breath." William chose that moment to let out a tiny, indignant cry, as if reminding his parents of his presence. Tucker laughed, the sound rich with joy. "And you too, little man, you too." As night settled fully over the Northrop ranch, the little family remained huddled together in the warm bedroom. bound by love and the promise of all the years to come, years that would bring challenges and joys, growth and change, but always the certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they had been seeking all along. A home, a family, a love to last a lifetime,